Have you ever wondered what happens when a weary veteran with nothing left but a loyal dog chooses kindness instead of giving up? In a quiet mountain town covered in winter snow, one simple act of repairing a broken fence led Daniel and his dog Buddy into a journey that would save lives, awaken a forgotten lodge, and restore a community. What if the smallest spark of courage could change an entire town? Enjoy the story. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The morning snow drifted across the narrow mountain road like slow-moving smoke. The sky hung low in a pale sheet of winter gray, and the wind whispered softly through the frozen pines that surrounded the small town tucked deep in the valley. The air carried the cold scent of ice and silence. For a place built on old timber and stubborn hearts, the winter felt endless. Daniel walked through the thin layer of snow that covered Main Street with steady steps and a calm, measured breath. He was a 40-year-old man, shaped by long years of military service and the weight that lingered after it. His height was slightly above average, and his shoulders remained broad from the physical demands of his former life. His hair was dark, though touched by streaks of early gray, and he kept it cut short out of habit. His jaw carried the roughness of stubble most days, because shaving felt less important than earning enough money to survive. A thin scar crossed the left side of his chin, a small reminder of a blast in Afghanistan that had changed the rhythm of his life forever. There was something reserved in the way Daniel moved through town. His eyes were a steady brown, but always seemed to search the ground first before meeting anyone else. People who saw him passing often assumed he preferred silence because he rarely spoke more than he needed to. In truth, he understood how to speak, but words often felt heavy in his chest. War had taught him that noise rarely solved anything. Still, he carried no resentment toward the townspeople. He simply lived quietly and tried to work hard enough to pay for his small rented room in the back of an old building that used to be a repair shop. Beside him walked Buddy, a 5-year-old German shepherd, with a strong frame and thick fur that shifted between tan and black. Buddy moved with disciplined precision, even though he no longer served as a working dog. His ears were tall and alert, and his amber eyes scanned every sound with the instinct of an animal trained to protect. He had once been by Daniel's side during long, dangerous missions in Afghanistan, where he learned to locate threats and sense danger before it arrived. Now his world had changed, but his loyalty had not. Buddy never let Daniel walk anywhere alone. There was a gentleness in the way Buddy leaned his head toward Daniel when the wind grew too cold, as if reminding him he was not alone. Daniel took whatever labor the town offered. On this morning, he was carrying an old metal shovel to clear snow from the steps of a hardware store owned by a man named Cole, who paid him in small bills and sometimes in a hot drink if the day was too cold. Daniel did not complain. He liked the routine and the steady rhythm of using his hands. It kept his thoughts from drifting back to places he wished he could forget. He had learned a long time ago that work was easier than remembering. As Daniel reached the storefront, he paused for a moment, taking in the muted quiet of the town. The buildings were old, with wood siding faded over the years by wind and snow. Smoke rose from a few chimneys and mixed with the winter air, leaving a faint smell of pine and ash. A woman carrying a basket of folded laundry walked by, bundled in several layers. She gave Daniel a small nod, a polite greeting common in small towns. He returned the nod with a brief lift of his chin. Buddy wagged his tail gently as she passed, sensing kindness without needing a spoken word. Daniel started clearing the steps with slow, strong strokes. Ice cracked beneath the metal shovel, and the sound echoed softly against the quiet street. Buddy sat a short distance away, observing the work with patience. Occasionally, he walked in a small circle, then settled again as if guarding the area. Daniel appreciated that silent companionship more than he could ever explain. Buddy grounded him in a way nothing else did. The dog reminded him of loyalty that did not break even when the world grew hard. As the morning passed, Daniel finished the job and tucked the payment into his jacket pocket. It was not much, but to him, it meant warmth and food for another day. He headed toward his rented room, planning to drop off his tools before searching for the next odd job around town. Buddy trotted beside him, leaving neat prints in the snow. A few children played across the street, rolling snow into uneven balls. Buddy glanced their way, but stayed close to Daniel, not wanting to wander far. Daniel felt the usual dull ache in his chest that settled there each time winter deepened. He had endured harder cold in the desert nights overseas, but this cold was different. It pressed on him in places he could not name. Sometimes he wondered if he had made the right choice coming to this remote town after returning home. He had no family left to return to, and no clear direction for his life. The town was quiet enough that no one questioned him too closely. They saw a hard-working man and a loyal dog, and that was enough. Still, he carried an emptiness he tried not to examine too deeply. Inside his room, he warmed his hands by a small heater, then fed Buddy from a metal bowl. The dog ate patiently, then lay near Daniel's feet, resting his head on crossed paws. Daniel sat on the edge of his small bed for a moment, breathing steadily. His thoughts wandered back to the faces of soldiers he had served beside, and the constant tension of nights when even silence felt dangerous. Those memories continued to pull at him even years later. He ran a hand through his hair and exhaled slowly, reminding himself that he had survived. That was something to hold on to. After a short rest, Daniel returned outside. He and Buddy walked toward the far end of town, where some houses sat scattered along the hillside. The wind picked up slightly, carrying thin flakes of snow that brushed against his coat. He kept moving, searching for more work. That was his routine. Work kept him upright. Work kept the past quiet. By afternoon, Daniel found another small job, helping an elderly couple lift firewood from their shed to their porch. The couple thanked him with warm gratitude. Their names were Mr. Turner and Mrs. Turner, a gentle pair with soft-lined faces and voices that carried the warmth of people who had known each other for a lifetime. Though they were not characters who returned in Daniel's story, they left a small mark of kindness on his day. Buddy sat calmly while they worked, watching the couple with attentive eyes. The woman bent down to pat Buddy gently, and he responded by lowering his head respectfully. When Daniel finished, he continued along a narrow path leading back to the main street. The sun was dipping toward the ridgeline, casting a soft blue shadow over the snow. The air felt heavier and colder. He found his steps slowing as fatigue set in. He had worked nearly every day since arriving in this town, and his muscles never fully relaxed. Still, he kept moving. Buddy walked closer now, brushing against Daniel's leg, sensing the weight pulling at his companion. Back in his room, Daniel prepared a simple meal and sat in silence with Buddy lying near his boots. He looked at the dog and felt a warmth that balanced the loneliness inside him. Buddy had saved him more times than he could count. In the desert, in the years after returning home, and now in this cold, quiet place where hope was something fragile. Daniel reached down and placed a hand on Buddy's head. The dog closed his eyes, content. As night settled outside, Daniel finished his meal and stretched out on the bed. Buddy curled at his side, a silent promise of loyalty. The room was small and the winter harsh, but the bond between man and dog formed a soft corner of warmth in the world. Daniel closed his eyes, knowing that tomorrow he would rise again and work until the day faded. He had no grand purpose yet, no clear future, and no family waiting. But he had Buddy. And for now, that was enough. The winter morning settled over the valley like a pale sheet of quiet light. Snow clung to the pine branches, and the cold hung low beneath the gray sky. The air was sharp enough to sting the skin, and the only sounds were the soft crunch of ice and the slow breath of wind drifting down from the ridge. It was the kind of morning that made every movement feel heavier than usual. Daniel walked with a steady but tired pace along the narrow snow-covered road, leading toward the far edge of the town. Beside him, Buddy moved with a confident stride, his paws sinking into the powdery surface, while his ears stayed alert. Daniel carried a small tool bag slung over his shoulder, filled with wire pliers and a hammer. The message he had received the night before was simple. A fence had collapsed near the woods, and someone needed help fixing it. It was not much of a job, but it was exactly the kind of work he relied on. It paid little, but the quiet routine suited him. It gave him something to focus on other than the memories that clung to him like cold that would not thaw. Daniel looked straight ahead as they walked. His eyes were still a tired brown, shaped by years of harsh sun and sleepless nights overseas. He never talked much about Afghanistan, but the tension that lived in his shoulders never quite left. His breath formed thin clouds that drifted behind him as he moved. He tried not to think too far ahead, and instead focused on placing one foot after the other. Buddy walked closer to Daniel each time the wind grew stronger. The dog's thick fur coat of black and tan rippled softly, and his tail stayed level, just as he had been trained. Buddy was younger than Daniel in years, but carried the maturity of a seasoned soldier. His gait was confident, and his senses seemed to stretch farther than the human eye could see. Daniel often felt more secure, simply because Buddy was there. Even now, he watched the dog glance toward the tree line, as if measuring every sound and scent. As they approached the final bend in the road, a small wooden cabin came into view. It stood on a sloped hill covered with a thin layer of white snow. Smoke rose gently from a metal chimney, indicating that someone inside kept a fire burning. The fence that needed repair stretched around the edge of the yard, though part of it sagged and leaned awkwardly. Daniel slowed his steps, observing the damage quietly. An elderly man stood beside the fallen section of fence, leaning slightly on a cane. His figure was thin, and the coat he wore looked older than the cabin itself. Yet the man's posture had a hint of dignity, as if he refused to let age bend him any more than necessary. His hair was white and wavy, falling to his collar. His beard was trimmed short, but uneven, in the way of someone whose hands shook too much to keep the lines straight. His skin was pale and slightly sunken, but his eyes remained clear and gentle. They were a faded blue, like the winter sky above the pines. This was Henry, the man who had, asked for help. Henry lifted one hand in greeting as Daniel drew closer. There was no strength in the gesture, but kindness made it warm. Daniel nodded in return and spoke in his usual quiet tone. "Morning, sir. I heard your fence gave out." Henry offered a soft smile that creased at the edges. "It did, son. Wind snapped it sometime last night. Happens more often than it used to. Age makes everything weaker, I suppose. Even fences. Even knees." Daniel listened, without comment, then crouched beside the broken posts. He pressed one glove against the wood and felt how brittle the boards had become. The winter had soaked too deep into everything. Buddy sniffed around the area, circling the fallen branches with slow, deliberate movements. At first, Daniel paid little attention. This was Buddy's habit. Scout first, relax later. But suddenly, the dog lifted his head sharply. His amber eyes narrowed, and his body tensed in a stiff, alert stance. Daniel recognized that posture instantly. Something in the air had changed. Buddy sniffed again, pushing his nose toward the direction of the wooded ridge behind Henry's cabin. His tail stiffened, and he let out a low, rumbling sound. Neither threat nor fear, just caution. Daniel felt the muscles in his back tighten. He trusted Buddy more than any piece of equipment he had ever used. Whatever the dog sensed came from instinct trained by years of surviving the unpredictable. Henry noticed Buddy's reaction and leaned slightly on his cane. The cold wind brushed his coat, but he did not move away. The dog senses something, does he? Always thought animals feel things long before we do. Daniel replied simply. He rarely gets nervous without reason. Henry breathed out slowly, the air forming a puff of white. "Well, there is an old trail up there that leads toward the ridge. Been abandoned for a long time. Weather turns strange sometimes near that slope. Nothing dangerous, though. Just memories of storms, I suppose." Daniel did not answer. He did not want to worry Henry. Instead, he placed a hand lightly on Buddy's shoulder and gave a quiet signal. The dog lowered his head, but kept watching the ridge. Daniel examined the fence more closely. The wood had snapped during the night, likely from a combination of wind and age. Fallen branches lay scattered nearby. He began to work without needing further instruction. He measured the broken post, then took out wire and set the damaged section straight. His movements were slow, but precise. He preferred working with hands rather than words. It kept his mind steady. Henry watched him work with calm, appreciative eyes. His breathing was thin and uneven, but his expression held patience and gratitude. After a while, Henry spoke again with gentle sincerity. "You remind me of my brother. He fixed things without being asked. Quiet fellow. Took care of everyone else before thinking of himself." Daniel continued tightening the wire and gave a small nod. He did not know how to respond to kindness spoken so openly. Buddy remained in a half-guard stance, circling slowly, then settling near Daniel, as if shielding him from whatever drifted in the cold air. When the repair was done, Daniel stood brushing snow from his gloves. Henry's eyes warmed with honest relief. "Thank you, son. You and your dog work well together. Hard to find companionship like that. You two look like men who have walked through storms together." Daniel glanced at Buddy. The dog looked back at him with steady trust. Daniel replied quietly, "We have, sir." Henry lifted a hand, slightly gesturing toward the cabin. "Come inside for a moment. I have warm cocoa on the stove. Not much, but enough to share. This weather eats the strength out of a man, and your dog looks like he would enjoy the heat." Daniel hesitated out of habit. Accepting offers always made him uncomfortable. Yet the cold morning wind pressed against his coat, and he saw the softness in Henry's tired face. The man looked as if he had not spoken to anyone for days, so Daniel nodded once. Inside the cabin, the warmth gathered like a blanket around the small room. The furniture was old but cared for. A stove crackled softly in the corner. Shelves lined the walls filled with photographs of people who seemed long gone. Henry moved slowly toward a wooden table, placing 3 mugs on its surface, one slightly chipped but clean. He spoke while pouring cocoa. Family used to fill this place with laughter. Lodge guests came through the trail for supper in the old days. My family ran a place up the ridge, Silver Pine Lodge. Used to be full of travelers before roads changed. It has been empty for years now. Daniel listened quietly. He watched Henry's eyes drift toward the window as if seeing something far away. The old lodge still meant something to him, something that time had not taken. Buddy settled near the fire, stretching his paws toward the warmth. He relaxed more now, but his gaze still flicked toward the ridge whenever the wind shifted. Henry took a slow sip, then lowered the cup with a sigh. World changes faster than we do, son. But sometimes, old places wait for the right footsteps to come along. That lodge has been waiting a long time. Daniel looked into the steam rising from his cup. He wondered how many people in this cold, quiet town were waiting for something too. Maybe he was one of them without realizing it. Before leaving, Daniel thanked Henry with a nod. Buddy nudged the old man's hand gently, earning a soft laugh from him. As Daniel stepped back outside with Buddy at his side, the winter morning still stretched across the valley unchanged, but something in Daniel's chest felt different, as if this small moment of warmth had opened a quiet door inside him. He did not know why, but he felt that meeting Henry mattered. The repaired fence stood firm behind them. Buddy walked close, brushing against Daniel's leg as they moved down the snowy path toward the main road. The wind carried the faint scent of pine, and the ridge loomed silent above. They walked together through the winter cold, unaware that this simple morning would lead to something far larger in the days to come. The winter sky rested low over the town as a soft gray sheet of cold light. Snow had fallen through the night and now lay untouched across rooftops and paths, smoothing the world into quiet shapes. The air felt heavy with stillness, and the morning sun fought to shine through the pale clouds. It was the kind of winter day when sound carried slowly and every movement felt softened by the weight of the season. Daniel walked along the snow-packed road with Buddy close at his side. The dog's fur held a thin dusting of frost, and his breath rose in warm clouds. Daniel kept his hands in the pockets of his worn jacket as he moved toward the small church near the center of town. There was no rush in his steps, only the quiet acceptance of a duty he did not expect to face so soon. He had learned 2 days earlier that Henry had passed away in his sleep. The news had hit harder than Daniel expected. He had known the old man for only a short time, yet something about Henry's gentle voice and tired but warm eyes had stayed with him. The church was small, with wooden siding painted white, though much of the paint had peeled from long winters. A single lantern hung near the door, casting a faint glow against the pale daylight. A few townspeople stood gathered outside, bundled tightly in heavy coats. Their faces were lined with the patience and endurance of people used to long winters and quiet losses. Daniel pushed open the door and stepped inside. Buddy followed silently, his claws clicking softly against the wooden floor. The interior was warm but dim, lit by a handful of candles placed near the front. The scent of melting wax, mixed with the smell of old wood and cold air, carried in through the doorway. Henry's simple wooden casket sat near the altar, surrounded by a few winter flowers someone had brought. The blossoms looked fragile against the cold light. There were only a small number of people present, a few neighbors, a couple of men from town who had known Henry decades before. One older woman who wiped her eyes behind a knit scarf. Daniel recognized none of them closely, but he felt a faint connection among them, the shared sense of having known a quiet soul who deserved more company than the world had given him in his final years. Daniel took a seat toward the back. Buddy lay down beside him, resting his head on Daniel's boot, as if sensing the heaviness in the room. The dog's presence grounded Daniel in a way nothing else could. He reached down to touch Buddy's head gently. The quiet warmth helped steady him. The minister spoke with a soft voice, calm and respectful. He was a tall, thin man named Reverend Harris, with a face lined from years of winter wind. His gray hair was thinning, and his hands trembled slightly as he held a small book. He spoke about Henry's gentle nature, his long life, and the quiet dignity he carried even as age took much of his strength. The words were simple, but sincere, reflecting the kind of man Henry had been. Daniel listened while his thoughts drifted. He remembered the warm cocoa inside Henry's cabin, the photographs on the shelves, the tired smile Henry had offered, as if grateful simply for another pair of footsteps in the cold. Daniel felt a pressure in his chest, a mixture of sadness and something heavier, something like responsibility. He wondered why the world allowed good men to fade into loneliness. He wondered why Henry had been so alone. The service ended quietly. People stood and slowly made their way outside. Snow drifted lightly through the open door as they stepped into the pale morning light. Daniel hesitated before leaving. He approached the casket and placed a hand on the smooth wooden surface. The wood felt cold beneath his glove. He murmured a silent goodbye in his own way, then turned to leave. Buddy walked beside him as they stepped outside into the crisp air. The town felt almost frozen in the moment, as if mourning with them. Daniel adjusted his coat and began walking toward the direction of his room when a voice called his name. "Mr. Pike, a moment, please." Daniel turned to see a man approaching from the street. The man was in his late 50s, with a narrow face, framed by neatly combed silver hair. He wore a long, dark coat and carried a leather briefcase. His posture was upright and precise. His eyes were a steady gray behind thin framed glasses. The man introduced himself calmly. "I am Mr. Allen. I handle legal matters for this town." Daniel nodded. His voice remained low. "Yes, sir." Mr. Allen studied him for a moment with a thoughtful expression. "Henry left instructions for me before he passed. He requested that I speak with you after his service." Daniel felt his stomach tighten slightly. He did not understand why. Henry had been kind to him, but they had known each other only briefly. What instructions would he leave for a stranger? They walked together to a small office building not far from the church. Buddy followed closely at Daniel's heel, his ears turning slightly with each sound. Inside the office, the air felt warmer and smelled faintly of old paper and ink. Mr. Allen gestured for Daniel to sit. Daniel lowered himself into the chair while Buddy lay at his feet. Mr. Allen opened a thin folder and spoke clearly. "Henry appointed you as the beneficiary of his personal property. His cabin and the land surrounding it including a place called Silver Pine Lodge. Daniel froze. He stared at the attorney, unable to speak. He had not expected anything like this. Henry had barely known him, yet had trusted him with something so large. Daniel's thoughts tangled in confusion and disbelief. Mr. Allen continued with a steady voice. Henry left a note explaining that he believed you were the right person to care for these places. He valued your quiet nature and the way you treated him with respect. Daniel lowered his gaze, stunned into silence. He remembered Henry's soft voice and the way the old man had looked at him, as if seeing something familiar in him. The weight of that trust settled heavily on Daniel's chest. Then Mr. Allen cleared his throat gently. There is something else. Silver Pine Lodge has unpaid property taxes from many years. If the balance is not settled soon, the county will seize the property. Daniel felt the world shift under him. How much? Several $1,000s. Mr. Allen paused. It is a serious burden. I am sorry. Daniel leaned back in his chair with a long, slow breath. He was nearly broke. He earned barely enough to buy food and keep a room. The only things he owned were an old pickup truck and Buddy. Taking on something like this felt impossible. Yet he could not ignore the memory of Henry's warm eyes or the soft way the old man had spoken about the lodge on the hill. Selling it to strangers felt like betrayal. Buddy nudged his leg gently, sensing the turmoil running through him. Daniel placed a hand on the dog's head and breathed out slowly. The pressure inside him grew tight. He felt confusion, sadness, fear, and a strange thread of loyalty all tangled together. He did not know how to handle what had been placed before him. Mr. Allen closed the folder with a quiet sound. The decision is yours. But Henry wished for you to know that he trusted you. He believed you would understand the value of the place beyond money. Daniel stood slowly, his expression heavy. He thanked the attorney in a quiet voice, then stepped outside with Buddy following close. The cold air rushed around him, and the weight of the news settled deeper. The snow under his boots crunched with each step, but he barely noticed. His thoughts spun in his mind more than the wind spun the falling flakes. He walked until he reached a quiet corner of the road. Buddy sat close, leaning lightly against Daniel's leg as if offering a small anchor of warmth. Daniel looked out at the frozen hills where the lodge stood unseen behind the trees. Something inside him recognized a pull stronger than fear, a sense that Henry had believed in him when he felt he deserved nothing. He could not walk away from that. Daniel breathed in slowly, feeling the cold air settle deep in his lungs. He did not know how he would face the burden. He had no money and no clear plan. But he knew one thing. He could not let the old man's memory fall into the hands of people who did not care. Buddy looked up at him, waiting. Daniel rested a hand on the dog's strong neck. We will figure it out. The words were soft, but carried a quiet resolve. The path ahead was heavy and uncertain. Yet as the winter wind pressed against them, Daniel understood that he had been given not just a burden, but a responsibility he could not ignore. And despite the weight, he felt the faint outline of purpose beginning to take shape inside him. The winter afternoon settled over the town in a pale and unmoving haze. Snow drifted slowly from the gray sky and covered every rooftop with a soft white blanket that seemed to mute all sound. The wind pushed lightly across the open fields, leaving small trails of swirling frost in its wake. The light was dim, and the cold felt sharp enough to carve itself into the wood of the cabins scattered along the hill. It was quiet, in a way only deep winter could be. Daniel stood outside Henry's cabin, staring at the old fence line covered in snow. Buddy sat close beside him, his thick coat dusted with frost. The dog watched Daniel with patient amber eyes, sensing the heaviness that had lingered since the reading of the will. Daniel's mind was tangled with worry and confusion. Silver Pine Lodge sat on the hill behind the trees, out of sight yet constant in his thoughts. The news of its debts weighed on him like an invisible chain he could not break. He did not know how long he had been standing there when he heard the distant crunch of tires moving slowly across the snow. The sound grew clearer, then stopped near the path leading to the cabin. Daniel turned slightly as a car door opened. A man stepped out, dressed in a long, dark coat that looked too clean for a winter road and leather gloves that shone against the pale day. The man walked with confident steps across the snow. His face was smooth and well kept, with a sharp jaw and no sign of stubble. His hair was black and swept neatly back with no strand out of place. His posture was tall and precise. He appeared to be in his 40s, though the polished way he carried himself made him seem older in experience. His expression held a cool detachment, as if he were already evaluating everything he saw, including Daniel. The man spoke with a tone practiced and steady. "Good afternoon, Mr. Pike. My name is Collins. I understand you are now the heir to Silver Pine Lodge." Daniel shifted his weight slightly. His voice remained cautious and quiet. "That is what the lawyer said." Buddy rose to his feet the moment Collins came closer. The dog's ears tilted forward, and a low, guarded sound rumbled in his throat. Collins paused and glanced at the dog with a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. "He is protective," Collins said, though his tone suggested annoyance rather than respect. Daniel rested a hand on Buddy's neck, giving a gentle signal to calm. Buddy lowered the growl, but stayed alert, his tail stiff and his gaze fixed on the stranger. Collins stepped closer and looked around at the old cabin with a faint expression of amusement. Charming in a rustic way. "But you must know, the lodge has far more potential than this lonely hill. I represent a development group, and we have interest in purchasing the lodge property. You would be compensated generously and immediately." Daniel's brow tightened slightly. He felt the familiar pressure of doubt behind his ribs. He had expected the burden of taxes. He had not expected someone to appear so quickly with an offer to buy everything. Collins reached into his coat and retrieved a small folder. His gloved hands moved with the precision of someone who spent his life handling papers more than people. Inside this folder is a formal offer, Collins said, tapping the cover lightly. "We plan to transform Silver Pine Lodge into a high-end winter resort. The location is perfect. With the right vision, it could bring tourists and business. You would not need to worry about debts or repairs or the decay already setting into the structure." Daniel remained still. The cold wind pressed against his coat, but his thoughts ran deeper than the weather. He remembered Henry's warm voice speaking about the lodge, a place that once sheltered travelers, a place that kept its doors open through storms. He remembered Henry's eyes when he mentioned it, a mixture of pride and longing. Daniel asked quietly, "You know the taxes are years behind." Collins nodded quickly. "Of course. That is precisely why our offer is so convenient. You could walk away from all obligations today." Buddy stepped closer to Daniel, pressing lightly against his leg. The dog's gaze never left Collins. Each time the man spoke, Buddy made a faint, low sound, almost too soft to hear, but sharp enough for Daniel to notice. The dog rarely reacted like this unless something in the air felt wrong. Collins went on speaking, with an even colder edge beneath the polished tone. I understand you are not in a comfortable financial situation. This offer could relieve you of a tremendous burden. You have no reason to hold on to an aging building with heavy debts. Let us take it off your hands before the county does. The bluntness struck Daniel harder than the words themselves. Collins spoke as though the lodge had no history, as though Henry had never lived, as though the place meant nothing more than empty land. Daniel felt something tighten inside him, a mixture of resentment and sadness. He answered slowly, I need time to think. Collins gave a thin smile. Of course, but I should warn you. The council will push for action soon. They prefer developments that bring revenue, not decaying lodges that drain it. Winter moves fast, Mr. Pike. I would not wait too long. He handed Daniel the folder, then turned back toward his car. Buddy growled again, louder this time. Collins hesitated but said nothing. He stepped into the vehicle and drove away, leaving a faint trail of snow behind him. Daniel stood in silence long after the car disappeared. Buddy pressed against his leg, still tense. Daniel placed a hand on the dog's shoulder, feeling the steady warmth beneath his fingertips. He whispered softly, I know, Buddy. Something is off. That night, Daniel paced inside his small rented room. The wind knocked softly at the window, and snow drifted in thick, silent sheets outside. Buddy lay near the door, with his head resting on his paws, watching Daniel with steady eyes. The folder lay on the table, but Daniel could not bring himself to open it again. He sat on the edge of the bed and pressed his palms together, trying to steady the storm inside him. He had no savings, no family, no plan. The weight of the taxes felt like a mountain resting on his shoulders. He feared failure. He feared losing the lodge. He feared disappointing the memory of Henry. Buddy stood and walked slowly toward him, then placed his head on Daniel's knee. Daniel felt the warm pressure and let out a long breath. Buddy had been with him through darker nights than this one. The dog's quiet presence reminded him that he was not completely alone. Daniel lay back on the bed, unable to sleep. His mind moved through the same circle of fear and uncertainty. The lodge was a burden he had not asked for, yet he could not bring himself to walk away from it. Henry had trusted him, and something deep inside him refused to let the place become another cold monument controlled by men like Collins. As the night deepened and the snow settled thick against the windows, Daniel remained awake. Buddy curled beside him, offering a steady rhythm of breath. The fear did not fade, but beneath it grew a thin thread of determination. He did not know what tomorrow held, but he knew one thing with quiet certainty. He was not ready to sell. He would face the burden even if it frightened him. He owed Henry that much. And maybe he owed himself more than he had ever allowed himself to believe. The winter afternoon settled over the valley in a still gray light. Snow lay thick across the rooftops and covered the ground in an unbroken sheet of white. The cold pressed heavily against the cabin walls, and the faint smell of pine drifted through the air. Shadows stretched long across the yard as the sun hid behind a curtain of pale clouds. A quiet calm filled the landscape. Daniel stepped into Henry's old cabin, carrying a small bag of tools and a sense of weight in his chest. He had returned to begin clearing the place now that it belonged to him, though the thought still felt unreal. Dust clung to the wooden floor, and the faint warmth left behind from Henry's life seemed to linger like a memory resting in the corners. Buddy followed close behind with slow steps, his breath forming soft clouds in the cold cabin air. The dog's ears were alert, and his tail moved with a steady, cautious rhythm. Daniel set his gloves aside and looked around the room. The cabin was small, but felt full, even in its emptiness. Photographs still lined the shelves. Old books remained stacked beside the chair where Henry used to sit, and the fireplace still held pieces of wood that looked half-burned. Daniel felt a pull of sadness as he imagined Henry moving through this space, living alone among memories that no longer spoke except through silence. He began clearing dust from the table and moving stray items into small piles. The work helped calm the restless fear that had followed him since Collins had made his offer. He wanted to believe he could save the lodge, but the burden seemed too heavy for a man with no money and no clear path. Still, he could not shake the feeling that Henry had left him the lodge for a reason. Buddy sniffed around the room with slow, deliberate movements. The dog moved toward the fireplace, then paused, tilting his head. He lowered his nose to the floor and sniffed deeper. His ears pricked forward, and he made a soft sound in his throat. Daniel turned. "What is it, Buddy?" Buddy scratched once at a loose floorboard near the base of the fireplace. Daniel watched as the dog pressed his paw again, more insistent this time. The board shifted slightly, as if it had been resting unevenly for years. Daniel knelt down and touched the plank. It lifted more easily than he expected. He pulled it up, revealing a narrow hollow beneath the floor. Inside lay a wooden box, no larger than a book. The wood was old and darkened with time. Daniel lifted it gently and brushed away the dust. Buddy stayed beside him, watching with unblinking focus. Daniel opened the box slowly. Inside was a folded letter and a small metal key attached to a thin strip of cloth. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable. It was Henry's. The words on the front read simply, "To the next keeper of the lodge." Daniel felt a tightness in his throat as he opened the letter. Henry's handwriting was shaky but clear. The message spoke of a promise that had lasted through generations. Silver Pine Lodge had once been a place for people lost in storms, a refuge for those with nowhere else to go. Henry wrote that the lodge should remain open for as long as someone cared enough to keep the fire alive. The key inside the box was meant to guide the next keeper towards something meant to help in times of hardship. Daniel folded the letter with slow hands. He felt the words settle heavily inside him. Henry had trusted him more deeply than he ever realized. Tears threatened behind his eyes, but he held them back. He whispered softly into the quiet, "I will try, Henry. I will try." Buddy nudged his arm, then turned toward the door, as if urging Daniel to follow. Daniel slipped the key into his pocket and stood. The dog stepped into the cold air outside, nose lifted, searching for a direction only he understood. Daniel followed him through the snow-covered trees, up the narrow path that led toward Silver Pine Lodge. The wind was sharp and carried thin flakes of snow across the hillside. The lodge had been abandoned for years, but still stood with a kind of worn pride, its dark wood siding contrasting against the pale winter sky. Buddy walked around the exterior, sniffing with intense concentration. Daniel watched him circle the building until the dog paused beside a small door that led to the basement. Buddy barked once, a short, alert sound. Daniel pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, and released a wave of cold air from below. He followed Buddy down the narrow wooden steps into the dim basement. The space smelled of dust, cold metal, and old timber. Shelves lined the walls, holding tools long untouched. Buddy walked toward one shelf in particular. He sniffed the lower section, then pawed lightly at the board. Daniel crouched beside him and pushed the small shelf aside. Behind it was a metal safe embedded in the wall, mostly hidden by age and dust. The safe was old-fashioned, with a simple keyhole that matched the shape of the key found in Henry's letter. Daniel inserted the key. It turned with surprising ease, as if waiting for this moment. The safe door opened slowly, revealing a small collection of items inside. There was a thin ledger filled with careful, handwritten notes, and a few government-issued bonds neatly wrapped in a faded cloth. The ledger listed modest but meaningful savings, each note dedicated to maintenance of the lodge or help offered to travelers during hard winters. The bonds were not enough to erase all debts, but they were enough to spark hope. Daniel felt something inside him shift. It was not a solution, but it was a beginning. It was Henry's final gesture of faith. Buddy sat beside him quietly, tail moving in a soft, slow rhythm. Daniel rested his hand on Buddy's neck and whispered, with steady resolve, "We can do this, Buddy. We are not finished yet." The basement felt less cold now. The burden remained, but so did something brighter, a reason to keep trying. The winter morning opened in a pale gray haze. Snow lay thick across the hills, and the air carried a sharp cold that cut through layers of clothes with quiet precision. Ice clung to the branches above the lodge, and every breath formed a drifting cloud that vanished almost as soon as it appeared. The sky held no warmth, and the day felt suspended in frozen stillness. Daniel stood outside Silver Pine Lodge with tired eyes and a resolve that felt heavier than the backpack he carried. The wind brushed against his face and left a sting across his skin. He glanced at the worn wooden structure rising before him with its sagging beams and tired windows. It was not much, but it was all he had and all he hoped to save. Buddy stood at his side, the dog's fur thick and dusted with snow. His ears were high and alert, as if he sensed the burden Daniel wrestled with inside. Daniel had made his decision. He would not sell the lodge. He would honor Henry's belief that the place had a purpose beyond profit. Early that morning, he had walked into the small town office with a stack of forms in hand. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with a narrow face and hair tied in a tight bun, had looked at him with mild surprise. She introduced herself as Marlene. Her voice was crisp and efficient, and she moved with the brisk energy of someone accustomed to sorting through mountains of paperwork. Her eyes softened slightly when she noticed Buddy waiting quietly near the door, but her tone stayed firm as she handed Daniel a long list of requirements. The permits were complicated: safety inspections, temporary shelter regulations, heating capacity evaluations, and emergency protocols. Each form felt like a barrier. Yet Daniel carried the papers out of the office with steady hands. He had faced worse, and he repeated that thought to himself as he trudged through the snow back toward the lodge. By day, Daniel continued his labor jobs around town. He shoveled driveways, stacked bags of salt behind stores, and repaired anything the townsfolk needed. His body grew sore from the weight of constant work. At night, he returned to the lodge, where silence and cold waited inside. With only a lantern for light, he hammered broken boards back into place and patched gaps where icy wind slipped through the walls. He cleaned dust from rooms that smelled of age and loneliness. His breath hung in the air like ghosts of the people who once found refuge here. There were moments when exhaustion pushed against his chest like a heavy stone. His thoughts would drift to the money he did not have, the debts he could not escape, and the relentless pressure from Collins and the council members who favored the rich investor's offer. Daniel felt the sting of fear whenever he imagined losing everything. Still, he kept his hands moving because stopping felt like surrender. But he stayed close through every hour. When Daniel worked in the dark basement, the dog lay at the foot of the stairs, watching with steady eyes. When a pipe hissed from a leak hidden behind a cabinet, Buddy growled low and alerted Daniel before water could flood the room. When Daniel collapsed into the old wooden chair to rest for a few minutes, Buddy pressed against his leg, warm and solid, grounding him in a way no words could. The first trial opening of the lodge happened on a night colder than most. The temperature had dropped suddenly at dusk, and icy winds swept down from the mountains. Daniel had posted a small, handwritten notice in town earlier, inviting anyone stranded by the weather to stop by for warmth. Only a few came. An elderly man with trembling hands and cheeks reddened by cold. A young mother holding two small children wrapped in thin scarves. A truck driver with frost gathered in his beard, his face lined from years of long roads and sleepless nights. The lodge was far from perfect, but Daniel had worked tirelessly to make it safe enough. He lit the wood stove and kept adding logs until the living area glowed with a faint orange warmth. The old chairs creaked under the weight of the visitors as they dropped into them with grateful sighs. Buddy walked from person to person. He sat beside the elderly man and rested his warm body against the man's thin legs. He moved to the young children, who sat shivering in their coats. His tail wagged slowly as he pressed close, helping to warm them. The children sank into his fur, their shivers easing as they leaned against him with small, tired smiles. The mother whispered a quiet thank you as she brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's face. Buddy stayed beside them for a long time, as if he understood that his presence mattered. Daniel watched all this while tending the fire. His exhaustion eased slightly as he saw the relief settling across the room. It felt like the lodge had begun breathing again. Word of what Daniel was doing began to move through the town. Not everyone approved. Collins returned several times, always wearing the same perfectly tailored coat and polished shoes that showed no sign of snow. His sharp gaze swept over the lodge with a mix of disdain and calculation. He insisted that Daniel was making a mistake and hinted that the council would not support an unprepared shelter. Each visit brought fresh pressure, and Daniel could sense the silent tension in Collins' posture, as if the man disliked being challenged by someone with so little. But others in the community began to see Daniel's effort in a different light. A woman named Ellen arrived one evening carrying a stack of thick blankets. She was short and round with rosy cheeks and dark hair tucked beneath a wool hat. Her personality was gentle and warm, like a hearth fire during a long winter. She placed the blankets into Daniel's arms with a firm nod and said she hoped they would help keep people warm. A thin, older man named Jacob came next with a bundle of chopped wood. His hands were rough, and his face carried deep lines, yet his smile held kindness. He explained that he lived on the far side of town and knew what cold nights could do to someone with no help. More people followed. Canned food, firewood, Small bags of coffee and spare gloves appeared at the lodge door. Each item gave Daniel strength, like quiet hands, lifting a burden he had tried to carry alone. Still, the resistance remained. Collins continued speaking to council members, and some of them voiced concerns about safety and liability. Daniel felt the weight of their doubt pressing against him, but every night when he saw the fire flickering in the lodge and heard Buddy breathing softly beside him, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Winter pushed harder as days passed. Yet inside the lodge, warmth grew slowly, one act of kindness at a time. Daniel worked until his hands blistered and his back ached, but he no longer felt alone in the struggle. Buddy kept watch, ready to bark at danger or curl around frightened children. The lodge was not finished, but its purpose had begun. The chapter closed on a night when the wind howled outside and the fire glowed steadily inside. Daniel sat on the floor beside Buddy, his hand resting on the dog's neck. Despite exhaustion, his heart held a small flame of hope. The lodge was open, people were helped, and the promise Henry spoke of no longer felt impossible. The night settled over the mountain valley in a heavy blanket of white. Snow drifted from a sky the color of steel, and the wind pushed against the trees with long, low moans. Icy flakes whipped sideways across the hill where Silver Pine Lodge stood with its windows glowing in the darkness. The air felt sharp with danger, and the world outside seemed to shrink beneath the weight of the approaching storm. Daniel stood near the front room, checking the old generator through the small window. The machine rested in the shed behind the lodge, its metal body rattling softly against the cold. He had spent hours repairing it in the past days, replacing wires and cleaning clogged parts until the engine sputtered back to life. Now, as the storm gathered strength, the generator hum felt like a lifeline, keeping the lodge warm and lit. Buddy sat at Daniel's side, his fur thick and dusted with frost, his body steady but alert. The dog had sensed the storm before Daniel did. Earlier in the afternoon, Buddy paced the lodge with nervous steps and pressed his nose against the window, as if reading the warnings carried by the wind. Inside the lodge, people huddled near the fire. The air smelled of burning wood and warm soup. A few elderly residents who lived alone had arrived earlier seeking safety from the cold. A pair of stranded travelers knocked on the door just before sunset, their coats crusted with ice. Daniel had welcomed them all inside with quiet urgency. Fear flickered behind their eyes as they listened to the rising howl of the storm outside. Daniel felt his own worry tightening like a knot in his chest. He had faced harsh nights in distant deserts and mountains during his years in the service, but this storm roused memories of loss and survival that still lived deep in his mind. He pushed those thoughts aside and focused on keeping everyone safe. The wind intensified. Snow struck the windows with force, and the wooden beams of the lodge groaned under the weight of the storm. A woman named Ellen sat near the fire with a thick blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her dark hair was tucked under a wool hat, and her round face glowed with concern. She spoke in a gentle voice to calm the children who clung to her sides. A traveler named Marcus, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and a thick gray scarf, stood near the doorway, helping Daniel secure extra blankets along the walls to block drafts. His hands moved with steady confidence, and he worked without complaint. For a moment the lodge felt steady against the chaos outside. Then Buddy stiffened. His ears rose sharply, and his body leaned toward the door. The dog released a low growl that vibrated through the silent room. Daniel turned toward him with a frown. "What is it, Buddy?" Buddy moved closer to the door and barked once, sharp and urgent. He pressed his nose to the crack between the wood and the floor, then barked again, louder this time. The sound echoed through the lodge, and the people inside paused, turning anxious eyes toward Daniel. Buddy looked back at Daniel with a stare full of insistence. The dog was not confused or frightened. He had heard something. Daniel stepped to the door and listened. At first, there was only the storm. Wind roared like a river of ice. Snow hissed across the porch, but then a faint sound drifted through the howl of the wind. A soft, distant cry carried by the storm. It was barely audible, thin and fragile, but it cut through Daniel's chest like a cold blade. Someone is out there. He grabbed his heavy coat and wrapped it tightly around himself. His breathing grew quicker, not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility. Others looked at him with silent questions. Daniel nodded once. "Stay inside. Keep the fire strong. We will be back." Buddy barked in response and pushed against the door with his paws. Daniel opened it, and a blast of icy wind tore into the room. Snow rushed across the floor like a burst of white smoke. Daniel stepped into the storm, with Buddy charging ahead, their figures swallowed almost immediately by the swirling night. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The storm pushed against Daniel with brutal force, and snow stung his face like shards of glass. Buddy moved ahead in short bursts, then looked back to ensure Daniel followed. The dog's fur whipped in the wind, but his movements remained sure and determined. Daniel trusted Buddy's instincts more than any map or compass. The faint cry came again, carried by the storm. Buddy heard it too. He gave a sharp bark and veered left, paws sinking deep into the snow. Daniel followed closely. His boots broke through drifts up to his knees, and cold seeped into his legs. Yet he pushed forward, guided by Buddy's fierce determination. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, until a shape appeared through the storm. A small wooden sled lay tipped on its side, half buried in snow. A man knelt beside it, his back hunched and his arms wrapped around two children. His face was pale and raw from the cold, his breath shallow. Snow clung to his eyelashes, and his lips trembled. The children were wrapped in thin jackets, and their eyes held the empty stare of cold closing in. Daniel dropped to his knees beside them. His chest tightened at the sight. He spoke gently to keep the father calm. The man managed a nod, but could barely lift his gaze. Buddy pressed close to the children, offering what little warmth he could. The boy closest to him buried his face in the dog's fur with a weak shiver. "We need to move now." Daniel wrapped his arms around the smaller child and helped the father rise. Buddy moved ahead through the storm, then returned, barking sharply whenever Daniel drifted off the safest path. The dog skillfully guided them around deep drifts and pockets of broken snow. Several times, Buddy braced himself and helped pull the sled as Daniel pushed from behind. His paws dug into the ice with strength and determination that defied the storm. The lodge lights appeared as a faint glow through the white blur. Daniel felt relief push into his lungs like a warm breath. Ellen threw the door open the moment they reached the porch. Warm air rushed out. People hurried forward to lift the children and the father inside. Marcus grabbed blankets and wrapped them around the freezing family. Buddy shook the snow from his fur and trotted to the children with soft whines while they reached weakly to touch him. The room filled with quiet awe as the reality settled in. The lodge had saved them. Buddy had saved them. Daniel stood near the fire, exhausted but steady. The weight in his chest loosened as warmth returned to his fingers. Word spread fast through the town that night. Silver Pine Lodge had been the only place with light, and Daniel and Buddy had gone into the storm when no one else dared. The lodge was no longer just an old building. It had become a beacon. The winter evening settled softly over the valley. Snow rested in quiet folds across the rooftops, and the cold air shimmered with a faint blue light left behind by the fading day. A calm silence stretched across the hills after the violent storm, as if the land itself paused to breathe again. From a distance, Silver Pine Lodge glowed with a warm, steady light that broke through the gathering dusk like a small beacon among the endless white. Daniel stood outside the front steps for a moment, letting the cold brush against his face while listening to the muffled laughter drifting from inside. His breath rose in pale wisps, and the chill in the air settled gently into his coat. But for the first time in a long while, he felt warmth growing from somewhere deeper than the fire behind the walls. The lodge felt alive, more alive than it had ever felt since he first stepped onto the hill. Buddy came to stand beside him, tail moving slowly, his fur thick and brushed with stray flakes of snow. News had traveled fast after the storm. By morning, local reporters had arrived wearing heavy coats and scarves pulled high against the cold. One reporter, a tall woman with long dark hair tucked beneath a knitted hat, carried a small notepad and walked with the calm confidence of someone who had told countless stories of hardship and hope. She introduced herself as Lila, her brown eyes bright with curiosity as she listened to the entire account. Her voice was steady and sincere as she asked Daniel about the rescue and the night Buddy had led the way through the storm. Daniel answered simply and quietly, speaking more about the dog than about himself. Buddy sat beside him, as if understanding the attention, his ears tilted forward and his amber eyes watchful. By the next day, the story spread through the town. People who barely knew Daniel spoke his name with respect. They called him the veteran who did not hesitate, and they called Buddy the hero who heard what no one else could. Daniel tried not to let the praise settle too heavily on him. His life had been built on simple work and quiet determination, not on recognition. Still, he felt a small lift inside his chest each time a child asked to pet Buddy, or an elderly resident stopped him in the market to thank him for what he and the dog had done. The influence of the story reached the town council faster than Daniel expected. The council gathered in their usual hall, a modest wooden building near the center of town. Inside, the air felt heavy with tension. Several members had opposed the lodge from the beginning, and Collins had been a frequent presence in their meetings. But now, the weight of public opinion hung over them like a thick winter cloud. People had seen with their own eyes that Silver Pine Lodge had saved lives during the storm. They had seen the lights glowing through the blizzard when the rest of the valley went dark. During the meeting, one council member, a middle-aged woman with stern features and silver hair pinned tightly at the back, spoke with clear, firm words. She said the lodge had proven its worth more than any argument ever could. Another councilman, a thin man with narrow shoulders and round glasses, nodded solemnly and added that a place capable of saving a family during the worst storm in years deserved support, not obstacles. Collins attended the meeting as well. He arrived wearing his usual tailored coat and perfect smile, but his expression faltered as he noticed the shift in tone. His confident posture drooped slightly when he realized the room had turned against him. For once, his smooth words found no eager ears. The vote was unanimous. The remaining taxes on the lodge would be erased, and Silver Pine Lodge would be recognized officially as the Silver Pine Community Warming Station. Collins left the hall without speaking to anyone. Daniel watched him go with a quiet exhale. The pressure that had shadowed him for so long lifted, replaced by a sense of fragile relief. The lodge was safe. The fear of losing it no longer followed him with each step. When he returned to the hill that evening, Buddy walked beside him with steady steps, his breath fogging the air as if echoing Daniel's relief. Soon after the council decision, Daniel received paperwork confirming his new role as the caretaker and manager of the lodge. The position came with a modest but steady income, enough to ease the constant worry of bills and empty cupboards. He held the papers in his hands with a kind of disbelief. After years of drifting, scraping by with odd jobs, and carrying the quiet weight of memories from distant battlefields, he finally had a place that felt like purpose. He finally had a home. Inside the lodge, the fire crackled warmly. People came and went through the evening bringing small gifts, blankets, or jars of soup. They greeted Daniel with warm smiles and grateful words. Buddy became the center of attention almost immediately. Children knelt beside him with outstretched hands while he lay on his side, tail sweeping across the wooden floor. His presence comforted them, and their laughter filled the lodge with gentle life. Buddy watched each child with patient eyes and nudged their hands softly as if letting them know they were safe. Daniel stood near the hearth with a mug of warm coffee cupped between his hands. His gaze traveled across the room. Near the window, two elderly men in thick coats played a quiet game of cards. A young mother warmed her hands while her child slept in her lap. A pair of travelers shared a meal and spoke softly about the storm they had narrowly escaped. The air was filled with warmth and flickering light, and a gentle hum of voices that rose and fell like a calm tide. For a moment, Daniel felt something inside him settle. He remembered Henry's gentle eyes and weary smile. He remembered the letter that spoke of keeping the lodge open for those who needed shelter. Daniel realized that Henry had seen something in him long before he had seen it in himself. The lodge was not just a building, it was a promise. A place to keep people warm when the world grew cold. Buddy barked softly, pulling Daniel's attention toward the children gathered near the center of the room. The dog lay in the middle of them, his fur warm against their small hands. One child rested his head on Buddy's side, drifting toward sleep. Daniel felt a smile rise slowly across his face. The scene warmed him in a way he had not felt in many years. It reached deeper than the fire or the lights. It touched something he thought the war had taken from him, a sense of family, a sense of belonging. As the night deepened, the lodge remained full of soft laughter and the steady glow of the fire. People had found warmth. Daniel had found direction. And Buddy, the dog who had walked through storms and silence with him, lay surrounded by those who adored him. Daniel felt gratitude swell in his chest. He had not only escaped hardship, he had built something that mattered. He had found a home, not just for himself, but for all who wandered through the darkness in search of light. The journey of Daniel and Buddy reminds us that even in the coldest seasons of life, warmth can rise from the smallest acts of courage and kindness. A veteran who once walked through loneliness found a home by choosing compassion over fear. A loyal dog, whose instincts never faltered, showed that bravery can come on 4 paws as easily as 2 feet. A forgotten lodge on a snowy hill became the heart of a community because people chose to stand together instead of turning away. When neighbors shared blankets and soup, when children rested their heads on Buddy's side, when Daniel kept the fire alive through sleepless nights, the world softened just enough for hope to grow again. Silver Pine Lodge became more than shelter. It became proof that lives change when we choose to listen, to care, and to lift one another. May this story remind you that miracles still move quietly through our days. Sometimes they arrive through a stranger's kindness, a loyal dog's guidance, or a warm light shining during a long winter night. As you face your own challenges, trust that God walks with you and still sends gentle signs of hope when you need them most. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who could use a little warmth today. Leave a comment to tell what moved you. Subscribe to join more journeys of faith and courage. May God bless you and every person you hold dear. And may His light guide your steps each day.